Nadia, please.
Yes, go ahead, Nadia.
Make us sound smart.
I started in 1970 at the University of Iowa. I took my first film course. I was a theater major at the time, and I got fascinated. I applied to graduate school at Iowa, got my master's degree there, and then came to Wisconsin to do my PhD. And we had a rather remarkable set of circumstances come together in 1977. I got my PhD that year. David got tenure here at Wisconsin. And we were offered the chance to write a textbook on basic film aesthetics, which became Film Art: An Introduction. And that, although it did not sell terribly well at the beginning, gradually became, I think, the standard work in the field. So that led me to decide, rather than trying to find a teaching post and having to commute somewhere else, I would become a full-time writer. And so I spent the next couple of years turning my dissertation into the book, Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible. And then we went from there, writing books. I was able to spend full time at it. So, and David was able to get some fellowships and so forth. And we kept publishing. Eventually, we decided to do a companion volume. This was in the late 1980s on film history. So that became Film History: An Introduction. And I think it was really in the 1990s that those books both became very well known. But another book that I think brought us to some prominence was The Classical Hollywood Cinema, which was published with Janet Steiger in 1985. And that, I think, has been, for many people, the work that they think of when they think of us. It's still in print, so it's become something of a classic itself, I suppose. But that was one of, I think, the major steps in our careers.
My story is a little different because I grew up on a farm, and so I wasn't able to see a lot of films as a young boy, but I did watch some films on television, and also read a lot about film. I got very interested in reading film history, even though I couldn't see the films, at least not immediately. So when I went to college, I joined the film club that was in the college, which showed films every week to the students. And I also continued to read about film, because when I started in the 1960s, very few universities in the United States taught courses on film. There might be a course in, say, the English department or the literature department about films and novels or films and plays, but there was no film studies as we think of it today. So I took courses in English, in drama, in art history, things like that, and still worked with the film club. And then I thought I would try to see, I expected to go out and teach English in high schools, and I did that for a year. But then I decided I wanted to go to film school and study film. This was 1970, and there were, again, as I say, very few programs in film studies. There were really only 3 at that time in America: NYU, UCLA in Los Angeles, and USC, University of Southern California. Those 3 schools were mostly production-based schools. They did have a small studies component, but only NYU had a big film studies section. There was a 4th choice, though, a school that didn't do much with film production, but did have a film program in a theater and communication department, University of Iowa. So I applied there and got in, and then I just went ahead and had took a graduate degree in film and wrote a dissertation. And between the period 1970 and 73, when I finished the coursework, a lot more film courses were being taught in the United States. That seems to have been a window that opened. So many courses, not necessarily all PhD or MA courses, but undergraduate courses in the history or art of film were being taught. So there were opportunities for me to be hired at places. There were some job openings for teaching film. So I wound up getting a job at the University of Wisconsin, as Kristin said, in 1973. And while I was there, I finished my dissertation in 1974. And then I just stayed teaching film courses. But we had a small faculty of essentially 4 people teaching film. One was production, and then I had 2 other colleagues teaching film. So there were just the 4 of us for many, many years. And still, though, we did offer a PhD in film, and we attracted good graduate students. And so our program has gone on from that period to the present. And that's where I've been. I've done guest teaching at various places, but I always return to Wisconsin. This is my home.
The first film course that I mentioned that I took was with Dudley. He was teaching a survey history course. And that was when I was a junior, an undergraduate. And eventually I applied for grad school there, and I became Dudley's teaching assistant in the same class, the film history class. So Dudley was very influential in getting me into the program and allowing me to have support to get my master's degree.
And he supervised my dissertation. I wrote a dissertation on French silent film, and he was interested. Of course, that's one of his main areas is French film. So he was ideal to do that. I think I got my dissertation maybe 2 or 3 years after he did his. So it was a very different time because young people could really move quickly. The film studies was such an early stage that you could make contributions as quite a young scholar because there was just so much we didn't know. And so it was exciting to be learning along with the other students, but also learning along with your professors.
Yeah, I think we were very lucky to get in at that early stage because we were able to write one of the first basic textbooks in film studies, film aesthetics. And now that field is very crowded. I would hate to be starting out in film studies now, but in those days, every possibility seemed open.
And the idea of a basic film aesthetics book was itself rather new at that time as a textbook. Of course, there have been many books on the aesthetics of cinema from the beginning of film, really, till now. But the idea of addressing a student audience, I think there was really only 1 or 2 other textbooks when we published ours. But those were typically not written by people who had been trained in film studies. Those other textbooks on film were really written by people in literature departments. And so we were, I think, the first people with PhDs in cinema to publish a film textbook. The other thing you mentioned, I think Mahmoud or Nadia mentioned in the communication with us, it is strange that this would all happen in the Middle West. I know you think of the United States probably as there's the East Coast, there's the West Coast, and there's this stuff in between, Chicago, you know. But it's interesting because what we think of as, and Nadia raised this in her email, I think, we think of the Ivy League schools as the leaders of the American university system. But actually, a lot of new things came out of Midwestern colleges and universities, partly because, I think, because the Ivy Leagues were very traditional in what they wanted to teach and research. So, for instance, Harvard did not have a film program for a decade after that we did. I mean, they are far behind. Yale also developed it slowly. It was partly, I think, because the traditions of those universities in their humanities, the professors in the departments probably didn't recognize film as an art form comparable to the other arts. They identified it probably more with popular culture. And at that time, people weren't studying popular culture either very much. So whereas we had a different structure, partly because the Middle West has traditions of, I guess I would say, cross-disciplinary study, where people doing one thing would move into another area rather easily. But also, there were specific situations for us at Wisconsin, because we had a very large film archive as in the campus, on the campus, and not at a library. Like, for instance, there's a big film archive, of course, in New York, the Museum of Modern Art. But this was attached to our university. So that meant that we could easily integrate what we were teaching in classes with what students could go into the archive and see. They could look at films, of course, hundreds and hundreds of films, but also documents, many documents, emphasizing both, on the one hand, the studio system of Hollywood. We got a very large collection of scripts, paper records, memos, all those kinds of things, production files for films made by several studios. But on the other hand, we also had collections of important independent filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, experimental filmmakers, and so on. And these had just been collected by our state archive for reasons complicated. I can go into them if you want. But at any rate, so we had a very big repository of films and documents that you could do research with. And I think this kind of helped us see a way to do something distinctive or unique that other universities couldn't do. They didn't have these collections at that time. Now they do. I mean, UCLA has a huge collection. I don't think NYU has a collection as such, but there are, other universities who have built up good collections of documents and films. But we were the first really to merge that material with our courses, our students' projects, our faculty research. One of our collections is the United Artists collection from the studio, this major studio, Charlie Chaplin, D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, all those people. But one of my colleagues has written the official history of the studio. He had all the material here, and he could interview people as well, and he just wrote 2 volumes that cover the entire studio's history. And that's just so unusual. That helped raise film studies, I think, here and elsewhere to a prominence. And the Ivy League schools eventually did the same thing, but we were a little bit ahead.
Yeah, and it was not only the paper documents, but there were many, many films, and the archive bought a bunch of viewing machines. They bought Steenbeck editing tables, I think 6 16-millimeter ones and a 35-millimeter one. And so you could go in and do very close analysis of the films they had, but they would also let you bring in your own film. So when I was doing my dissertation, for example, New Yorker very kindly loaned me a 35-millimeter print of Ivan the Terrible. And I had it for 6 weeks. I spent 6 weeks at that 35-millimeter Steenbeck taking, detailed notes and making photographs for my illustrations, which is another thing that I think we sort of pioneered here in Wisconsin, which is the use of actual frames from films as illustrations for our books. We never wanted to use just, the kind of production stills that were used for publicity purposes by the studios. We wanted to show the film as it looked on the screen. And we've done that ever since. And I think that's had quite a bit of influence in the field, in that more and more people have done that. And of course, now with DVDs and Blu-rays, it's quite easy to take a frame grab and use that as an illustration. And that's what we do now ourselves. But we used to have elaborate equipment and photograph directly from the frames with on film, of course. That was a very useful thing that the archive did as well. It encouraged close analysis of the kind that otherwise you would not be able to do on home video, which did not exist at the time.
Yeah, that's worth mentioning. This is all pre-video. For your younger participants, it'll be hard to imagine a situation where the way you would write about a film was to go into the auditorium with a pad and quickly write everything as it's happening. You can't stop it. You can't go back. You simply have to just make your notes in the dark and hope that you're accurate and hope that you've seen the things you wanted to see. And you might not get a chance to see that film again. When I was doing my dissertation, some archives I visited about these silent French films didn't have those facilities. So I had to sit there and scribble in the dark my notes. But when I went to Paris, the Cinémathèque Française allowed me to use an editing table. So I could run the film and stop it. They wouldn't let me take pictures, but they did let me stop and take time to make notes, complete shot breakdowns, things like that. And as a result, as Kristin says, I think we were about the first to use frame enlargement, certainly in the textbooks. We were the first textbook to use the actual frames from the films, but we were among the first to use the actual frames of films for scholarly work as well. If you look at some journals of the 1970s, people are starting to actually take frames. The French did it earlier too. Raymond Bellou's books on film were frame enlargements. So there was a general trend toward this closer documentation, we might say, of exactly what is on the film. And that was part of what was happening in these school programs that were expanding in the 1970s.
Early on, when we wanted to use frames, we often were told by the publishers that we needed to get permissions from the studios that owned them in order to be able to legally use them as illustrations. But in the early 1990s, I was asked to do a report on the concept of fair use. You know, the idea that you can use these kinds of images without permission if you're doing it in an analytical context or academic, scholarly context. So I wrote a report showing, on the basis of experts I consulted, that film frames did constitute fair use. They're very, very tiny excerpts from a very long series of images in a film. And that report was published, and that has had an impact on publishers. Many of them have changed their policies. They no longer require permissions, so it's become much easier to do analysis and use quite a few illustrations and without having to either ask permission or even having to pay a fee to get that permission. So that, I think, has had an impact on the field as well, that people feel more comfortable using frame enlargements, and their publishers will allow them to do that.
Well, in my case, it was because I like my colleagues, the people I work with. I'm very happy with them, but we had a special ambience. I think we were community, and I learned so much from my colleagues and my students that I wouldn't have done the work that I have done if I hadn't come here. Also, as you probably know, Ivy League schools are private universities, and I'm a creature of a public university. I don't know if you have the same distinction there, but private universities are themselves, they're sovereign in a way. They have their own status, and they're funded by private income, donations, and of course tuition. But I grew up in a system of state-sponsored universities. My undergraduate degree was from a state university, which is paid for, you know, as a part of the state's education system. And the same thing for University of Iowa, which is a state university. So I've always just felt more comfortable teaching in students who are like me. I mean, basically, that came out of, you know, they're not necessarily, some of them are their first in their family to go to college, as I was. Some of them are people who are attached to the area, the region, whatever. And in a way, there's a kind of, I don't know, it's also Midwesternness. I like the Midwest. I like the way people behave in the Midwest. They're very unpretentious. They're very straightforward. And so I just like the atmosphere, I guess I would say, of this university. And it's been very good to me too, because it has allowed me time to do my research. And of course, these resources that we mentioned can't be duplicated other places. I could travel, of course, come back and look at things in our archive, but it somehow just feels right to be able to park my car and walk to the library or the archive and go exactly where I want to know, where I know where I'm going. And so, although I think the pay is better, I mean, I know the pay is better at the private universities, but we don't need a lot of money. And so we just, we kind of still live like graduate students, actually. And so staying here just seemed like the best choice.
Yeah, it's the same with me. I mean, my parents were both getting their master's degrees at the University of Iowa when they met and married. And I was born in Iowa City. And I visited Iowa City because my grandmother lived there. I was just very familiar with it. And so when it came time to apply for college, I decided I would apply there. And so I did. I spent 6 years there for my undergraduate and master's degrees. And yeah, I was raised in the Midwest as well, in Illinois. So yeah, we're both from the Midwest. And I don't think I ever really conceived the idea that I could go to Harvard or Yale or Cornell or wherever. It just, it seemed natural.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also things about when you're at a certain point in your career, it's just too much trouble to move, there's lots of factors involved.
Well, also we had income from the textbooks. So right. We didn't need two incomes to live reasonably well and mainly to be able to afford to travel to do research.
Right.
That was what the textbooks supported, was right. Going to Europe and working, say, in the Brussels Film Archive, which has been very hospitable to us. We've right. worked there many, many times, but we've been able to finance that ourselves because of the textbooks.
Yeah, I mean, that's important. Also, we don't have children, so which would have been a big economic factor as well. So we've been able to save our money and use it for our research. I'm sure we have made mistakes. That would be the first thing I'd say, because no history is completely accurate. But I guess I would say one of the things we tried to do in the history textbook was to do some things that other history textbooks had not done. And that's one of the reasons the book is so long. Most history textbooks don't say much about form and style of film. I mean, they do talk about early cinema with editing and the development of certain things, but they don't pursue it into the future, into the past. Then it becomes, the later chapters about recent films tend to be much more, I guess I would say, journalistic, summarizing plots or picking out directors. And we thought it was interesting to look at the conditions of production in different countries, the industry, I guess you would say, in different countries. That was something that wasn't really emphasized in other film history textbooks. Of course, there are many people studying film industries in Latin America, Middle East, Europe, and so on. But that kind of information wasn't really absorbed into the textbooks that students would read. It was much more for specialists and scholars. So we tried to integrate as much as we could about how film artists in different countries made their films. What were the constraints they worked in terms of the industry, in terms of budgets, or in terms of influences within the industry. So we tried to look at that as something new we could add to the telling of the story of different cinemas. So I guess I would say we were looking at certain contexts a bit more than the other histories that were out there, that survey histories for student use. That would be one thing. I think the other thing is, again, the close analysis. I mean, we did try to do that, although it's very difficult with so many films you're surveying in so many countries. But we did try, and even in the illustrations, to try to enhance the book by suggesting different directors, styles, different period styles, things like that, that would give students a bit of film appreciation as well as just the facts of the matter. So we just spent a long time on it too. I mean, we spent, what, 6 years?
Well, it wasn't that. It was more like 4 or 5. But again, I have to mention the Cinematheque in Brussels, because they have a vast collection. One tends to think of Belgium as a very small country, but they have one of the largest film archives in the world. And they collected from all over the place. So I would say close to half of the illustrations in that book were taken from prints at the Brussels Cinematheque, because they have been so hospitable to us. And also, by the time we were writing that book, of course, home video had come in. So we were able to watch films, not to get illustrations from them because the quality was too poor, but we were able at least to watch quite a lot of films that we would not have been able to see otherwise. So we really made an effort to fill ourselves in on countries that we had not studied before. And that was quite fascinating. It was it was a difficult book to write, more so than film art, because it was so vast, but it was also very rewarding in the sense that we were learning about a lot of films that we had never seen before, discovering classics. It was also, it happened in the wake of the 1970s discovery of early cinema, with the Brighton Project and various scholars beginning to specialize in very early cinema. And so things that had been very obscure before were becoming well-known and available. I mean, we had known about Edison's films, Porter and Méliès and so forth, and the Lumiere brothers. But suddenly we knew about all these other filmmakers that we may have heard of, but we're not able to watch films by, like Fayad. So it was a very good time to be writing that book. And as we do further editions, of course, now we're able to use Blu-rays to get our illustrations. And quite often they're much better quality, but it was, we did it at just the right time, I think.
It's worth mentioning too that the archives we visit often have unexpected treasures in them. For instance, we think of the Library of Congress in Washington. They have a huge film archive, but we would think, well, yes, it would be American cinema. That's what they would have. But actually, they have hundreds of films from other countries, depending on what the curators have decided to collect. So, for instance, I was able to see about 20 or 25 Indian films from the 1930s, 40s, 50s that are in the Library of Congress in the United States. Why? I don't know, but there they are, 35 millimeter prints. And so I could sit at the editing table and watch these classics. And this is, again, before they were available on video, or at least some were available on videotape, but nothing, of course, like digital video. And what was funny was I would see films at the Library of Congress, but then I would also, when we were in, say, London, would find these Indian food stores that also sold video copies of Indian old classics. So between the archive there and what was on bad, but admittedly somewhat acceptable home video, I didn't have to go to India. I could just get a good sense of what the film cinema world there was like. And that happened again and again, as Kristin says, with Brussels, because they collected very openly. I mean, you can see Japanese films in Brussels, you can see Chinese films. I mean, they just, every time because it's a kind of crossroads of Europe, many distributors deposited their films there. So a distributor in Belgium was showing, Chinese films or Japanese films or whatever, they would, by law, have to donate one copy of every film they distributed to the archive. So a vast library of international cinema is sitting in this little city of Brussels.
Well, also, there was a law that every distribution print that was discarded had to be sent to the Cinematheque. And Jacques Ledoux, the curator, built up a relationship with Gus Filmofond in the Soviet Union, and he would be trading James Bond films or The Sound of Music because he had so many prints, and he would trade them for all these Soviet and early Russian classics.
Mm-hmm.
And they were required by law to subtitle them in Flemish and French. And so we could actually read the subtitles in French rather than Russian, which of course would be impossible for us. So it's a magnificent collection of Russian and Soviet films. And
I guess the general point in answer to your question, Mahmoud, is most people who wrote about film histories wrote from a very American-centered perspective. They thought the history of world cinema is either American cinema or reactions to American cinema. So European avant-gardists or this poetic realism in France or other movements are reacting against or to, in some way, American cinema. They were also very festival-oriented, so that, for instance, most histories, when we started to write this, would say, oh, yes, Kurosawa. Kurosawa is very important, and he's important for Rashomon, because that was shown at European festivals and got a lot of attention. But first, they don't mention or don't actually consider the earlier films of Kurosawa before Rashomon, and they don't consider other major directors like Ozu, Mizoguchi, and many, many more, because those were what Americans thought of in relationship to foreign cinema. So we tried to create a more international perspective where America is very important, of course. American filmmaking is very important, but there are all these other important filmmaking traditions, like the Iranian tradition, that were just neglected by the mainstream film histories, because not until recently did people have access to such films, but also because everything was seen as having been an offshoot or a consequence of Hollywood. So we were able, I think, to take advantage of, as Kristin says, of a moment when people in film studies were starting to write monographs on specific national cinemas or trends or whatever. At the same time, we were able, by visiting archives, to get some exposure to those films. And we should also add festivals. Festivals were very important. I remember, again, it was in Brussels when I was doing research, seeing my first Kiarostami films. I saw Homework and Where's the Friend's Home? And I just was amazed. I just thought these were great films. They were absolutely important films. And then a year or so later, I was in the Hong Kong Film Festival and I saw another Kiarostami film, Through the Olive Trees. And I thought, this is a very great film. And festivals, by going to festivals, we could get a sense of contemporary cinema that most Americans did not get, because most of those films, many films by Kitano or by Wang Ar-wai or Kiarostami and the other Iranian masters, all of those were not widely seen by Americans. And so people writing about cinema were very US centric, whereas going to festivals and visiting archives just broadened us out so much, we had to deal with all those cinemas.
Yeah, to go back though, when we were first starting out, this would be basically in the late 1970s, early 1980s, no one had really studied the Hollywood cinema closely. And we were interested in alternative cinemas, Soviet cinema of the 1920s and Ozu and so forth. And we wanted to study them, but we knew they were different from the classical Hollywood cinema. But nobody had defined the classical Hollywood cinema. So that was why we set out in the late 70s to write the classical Hollywood cinema, because we wanted to know what were the norms and guidelines and traditions of Hollywood that had been so stable over the years, and then be able to say how someone like Ozu is completely different from that, or someone like Kiarostami. So the classical Hollywood cinema was sort of a way of clearing that away, saying, okay, now we know what those norms are, and we can go on and compare any other cinema in the world that uses different norms. And so David wrote about Eisenstein and Ozu, and this was, I think, classical Hollywood cinema was not the sort of goal of our lives. It was the premise on which we were going to base much of the rest of our work.
This goes back to my point about being at Madison. Had I wound up teaching at an Ivy League university, I wouldn't have had the same colleagues who could help me. So for instance, in studying Japanese cinema, there were wonderful scholars in the history department and the Asian language department who helped me with studying Ozu and Mizoguchi and so on. And graduate students there helped me with translations and things like this. Now, it's true, there are many great scholars in the Ivy League schools too, but somehow just the intimacy of this community helped a great deal. The other thing I guess I would say is that our one colleague, Tino Ballio, and this is in reference to what Kristin was saying, who acquired the United Artists collection and wrote the books I mentioned about United Artists, he really, for me, and I think also for Kristin, convinced us of the importance of the business, of how all filmmakers face certain economic constraints. And so the question is, how do you make your film within a budget, with a structure of a studio operation or whatever? And I think that's one of the things we tried to do with the classical Hollywood cinema, was integrate the study of the art with the conditions of the industry. How does the industry both limit but also encourage certain kinds of cinema? And that I think we would not have done had we not come here, because there weren't many people, but like Tino or our friend Douglas Gomery, who were actually studying the structure and behavior of the film industry as a business. So, and that influenced our thinking very much in that book. There are many now, apart from us. I would say New York University is very good. Columbia University is very good, if they want to go to New York. In Texas, the University of Texas Department of Film is very good. Thomas Schatz is there. Janet Steiger just retired from there. On the West Coast, certainly UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, USC, University of Southern California. But there are many more programs than this now. There are many, many programs. And all of them are quite impressive, I think. Indiana University has a good one. Of course, University of Chicago has a good one. I think there are listings that you can go to. I haven't kept up really because I'm retired, but there are places listing film departments and universities. But there are many, many choices now, many more than there used to be.
Well, I think we try to see all the Iranian films that are playing at any festival we go to. And Vancouver has been very good. We usually catch up with maybe 2 or 3 recent Iranian films. Our own film festival, the Wisconsin Film Festival, was held only a few weeks ago. It was streaming, of course, but we saw Sun Children by Majidi. So that I wrote about that, a very fine film. And we had seen There Is No Evil at streaming from Vancouver. So yes, we try very much to keep up, and with at least the directors whose films make it to the festivals.
I think it's partly a question of taste. I think we feel very much in sympathy with the Iranian films that we've seen. We can appreciate the filmmakers as artists. We don't get to see the more popular or commercial films. As you know, we get to see what is put on the festival circuit one way or another. But those are very attractive to us. I think more generally, we seem to have found certain national cinemas of this moment very sympathetic to us, I guess I would say. For me, it's always been Japan. I love Japanese cinema. Later, it was Iranian cinema, Hong Kong cinema for me also. I think maybe Kristin also to some extent. So I think it's just something about the creative dynamic that we find in so many films from a certain country or region that match our sensibility, I guess I would say. I have to admit, there are certain regions I'm just not interested in the films of those regions. But somehow Iranian cinema, we always try to see every Iranian film we can, both historically and currently, because we know they'll be interesting. Because they always. One of the fascinating things to me about the modern Iranian cinema is its diversity. I mean, really, lots of, on the one hand, very realistic, sort of almost in the neo-realist tradition of trying to document people's everyday lives, but at the same time, very formally experimental in many ways, trying different methods, like I think of a movie like Fish and Cat, where, I forget the director's name, I'm sorry, but the boldness of that film is really striking. And almost every Iranian film has something in it, I think, I have never seen that before. I've never seen that technique before. I've never seen a story quite like this. Everything that we see seems to have just that extra originality that give us hope for cinema. I like to say that, to me, the 1990s gave me hope for cinema because my, directors, 3 or 4 directors, Kitano, Wangar-Wai, Kiarostami, and others. I mean, I thought, okay, cinema can do new things. It isn't dead yet, People were always talking about in the late 90s, it's been 100 years of cinema, but all the classics are gone. The great directors are dead. Cinema's over. And seeing films from Iran, from Hong Kong, some American films too, like by Jarmusch and people like that, but also these other countries, I thought, no, cinema is not dead at all. People are still very creative and original. So to me, Iranian cinema falls into that area of a must see. I feel I will always have something interesting to look at and think about if I see an Iranian film. Yeah, it happens. I mean, across film history, you see moments of great creative energy in a national cinema, and then it declines. Overall, from my knowledge, and it's just limited knowledge, there are some national cinemas that have been valuable and interesting and creative almost from the beginning of cinema. I mean, certainly American cinema has been that way. Japanese cinema, I would say, has been that way. Arguably, German cinema, maybe. But there aren't so many that have a consistent, level of activity, or level of quality, or whatever. And that's because cinema is, as you say, subject to all the circumstances of politics, of social change, technology, all these things create gaps or shortfalls in some national cinemas. I can't speak to current Iraqi films because I haven't seen any. I mean, I'm not aware of them. But certainly the idea that film industries have peaks and valleys, that is true, I think, across most film history.
Well, for writing film history to begin with, we pretty much had to assign different parts of the world to ourselves because we don't write together, we write separate chapters. So I took on Australia, New Zealand, I took on Africa, the Middle East, South America, and David did pretty much most of Asia and Europe, and we sort of shared North America. So I still am in the habit of going to films from, as it were, my countries when I go to festivals. And So I'm watching Australian films, or I'm watching Nigerian films, or Argentinian films, and Middle Eastern films. So that not exclusively, but it's sort of become a habit, I think.
Mm-hmm. One thing I think I should say is that we're probably least prepared to write about the Middle East on the one hand and South America on the other, because again, with accessibility, so many South American films, despite our America having a Hispanic population, very few South American films were available to us when we started writing about film history generally. There we were very reliant on prior research to steer us towards the major works. And so we probably missed a lot of good cinema as a result. But some areas we've done a lot of research in ourselves. And those, I think, are ones where we feel more confident. For instance, Kristin has been studying silent cinema for years and years and years, especially the major European countries. So she's able to write with a lot more confidence, I think, about silent film generally. Whereas I've studied Japanese film for many years, so I could write about what little Japanese cinema silent cinema survives, but I feel more confident about writing about later Japanese film, even though there are many scholars who are much more thoroughly so absorbed or immersed in Japanese film than I am. But I feel more confident about those. And the same with America, since we both studied American cinema and some areas of Europe. So like, for instance, German cinema with Kristin. And together we've written about Russian film, and I've done more research on that. So some areas of the book reflect our own expertise, and other areas reflect our interpretations of other people's work and what they've added to the dialogue. And we have tried to add our own bits to the conversation through watching the films and trying to see connections between them and so forth. But we don't have all I'm saying is we don't have equally deep expertise in all those chapters, what those chapters represent. I guess I'd say we're probably somewhat broader than many historians, because most historians find one area to concentrate on for their whole career, and we jump around more. But on the other hand, we're still learning a lot about even our own specialties. First of all, every film scholar has to be interdisciplinary, because almost any question we ask, and I assume that our work is guided by research questions. We do our research because we have a question about something. There's a puzzle we want to solve. There's some ideas we want to explore. So we pose them as questions. And I think almost any question we ask about film will always take you to another disciplinary field. So for instance, if you're interested in, say, film acting, film performance, you have to know about the history of theatrical performance. You have to know in different countries, different contexts, and so on. So automatically you have to do some research and rely on experts in those adjacent fields to guide you in answering your question. And the same thing, I would argue, goes for studies of any art. So films, in most cases, but in film particularly, because it is such a synthetic art. Film brings together images. So there's photography, but also painting involved. It's sound, so there's dialogue, there's music, there's plot or story elements. So you have to understand literary devices and so on. So, I mean, film is such a collection of many other media. It's a composite art, really, that it requires people to go out, ramify, explore adjacent fields of scholarship. So with philosophy, I'd say, I don't do that very much because I'm not trained in philosophy, though I've taken some courses, but I can't consider myself a philosopher. But a good example would be our friend Noel Carroll, who has a degree in philosophy and a degree in film studies. And he brings together these kinds of questions very usefully, I think. So when he wants to write about he could be a critic and write about a film that has a suspense. But Noel would say, well, what is suspense really? What are the conditions for suspense? What do we mean when we talk about suspense? These are more philosophical questions. And again, because he had the particular research question he was interested in, that led him to what philosophers had to say about the subject of suspense, philosophers of art. So I see these as always, no matter what you do in film studies, it's very likely you will be needing to know things outside, quote, specifically film things. To go back to my friend Tino Ballio, our scholar here, he had to become expert in economics and business practices in order to talk about United Artists as a company. So yeah, I see this as completely, interdisciplinarity is completely natural. For me on the philosophy front, I'm trying to do something sort of more empirical, I suppose, and that trying to figure out, for instance, in narration in the fiction film, I began by asking, what makes it possible for film audiences to follow a story? We know they can do that. They can talk about the story later. They all understood it to some degree. But the question is, what made it possible? So I began to think, well, I could look at psychology because there's a lot of research that was emerging then on how people understood stories, literary stories, but they might be applicable to film. And that led me to cognitive psychology as a model for how filmic understanding might be thought about. But on the whole, I'm not really sufficiently expert in philosophy to feel that I really work at a philosophical level. But I do find concepts in philosophy very useful, like Wittgenstein's family resemblances theory. So I guess I would say the philosophical implications of film interest me to some point, and I do a little with them, but I'm certainly not a philosopher with the depth of many others. A historian friend of ours says, I'm a historian, I don't make predictions. I only talk about the past. I don't know what's going to happen. Well, I guess I would say a couple things. One of those debates about the death of cinema back in the 90s were about whether the audience was still interested, whether the audience wanted to see movies. And sometimes the debate was, oh, all the great films have already been made. Everything now is weak. The debate now seems to be much more about the medium on the one hand. We have the question of whether is cinema a separate medium from, say, digital cinema? Let's say photographic cinema, is that different from digital media? Or are they both cinema, but they're different because the way, say, engraving is different from painting? Is that the kind of difference, that there's a kind of medium umbrella that includes cinema and digital? And it is a very interesting question, because I don't think we thought cinema was a photographic medium. But digital raises the issue of saying, no, it's not inherently a photographic medium, because you can make a movie on your computer with taking pictures of nothing. You can collage, you can draw your film. You don't, and remember, George Lucas said, he said, digital cinema makes film more like painting than like theater or photography. And I think that's partly right, that the idea that you could create a film without any reality to be photographed. That's always been possible. It was possible at the beginning of cinema when people drew on film. It's just that photography made it so much easier than going frame by frame. But so these have been very interesting debates, but clearly now people use the term moving image media, which include film and video, I should say film and digital cinema, but also video games and maybe other things too. The Japanese now have what they call visual novels, which are video games, I guess, but they're role-playing games. And they tell a story that you can simply watch as if it were a film, but you participate a little bit. So it's all, very wide-ranging now. And I think this is interesting, but I do think that it's all valid as art forms. The only problem I've had is with virtual reality. Virtual reality, I've seen now a fair bit of it. It doesn't seem to me quite there yet. It doesn't seem to me either satisfying on the aesthetic level or feasible on the technical level. They don't seem to be quite ready yet. But that will be included eventually, I'm sure, as part of moving image media. In terms of the future, I think a lot of us thought, because of the COVID pandemic, that people would stop going to films. Maybe they will to some extent. I think there are some people who, with the rise of streaming, and you probably have streaming in Iran too, don't you? Yeah, with the rise of streaming, probably a lot of people will stop going to cinemas, going to theaters, or go very seldom, only for certain things. But I think there are still a lot of people who just want to see movies in theaters with groups of people. In the United States, I think there will be fewer cinemas, probably, fewer screens, theatrical venues, but they won't go away entirely, I don't think, in terms of the audience. I think there's an audience there that wants to go to cinemas. And that may be true in Iran too, I don't know. But clearly streaming has become the new home video, replacing videotape, disc, and other items because it's so convenient. It's just hugely convenient to stream anything, anytime you want. And for a flat fee, you can see everything. So in the United States, as you probably know, there are a lot of debates about this because the question is, with all these streaming outlets, will people decide it's too expensive? It's too expensive to pay for Netflix and Amazon and all the other sources. And they're dividing up the film libraries in such a way that if you want to see an old Hollywood movie, it might be here, it might be there, but if you're not a subscriber, you can't access it. So in some ways, it's more constraining. But clearly, some people will decide that high quality streaming is okay to substitute for, on the one hand, cable television, and on the other hand, going to the cinemas. How much that will extend things, I don't know. It is interesting that more and more American directors, and this may be happening too in Iran, more and more American directors are making films just for streaming. They're not even having theatrical release, which suggests that those directors, like Steven Soderbergh, for instance, thinks that that's the future. But I still think there'll be people like Christopher Nolan who insist on having their films released theatrically with big screens, with lots of noise and everything, because they believe in that experience.
Well, I have to say that as a film historian, I look back and see that no significant art form has ever died. I mean, movies were supposed to kill theater. I mean, people have been predicting the ends of art forms all through the 20th century. Movies were supposed to kill theater, radio was supposed to kill movies, television was supposed to kill radio and movies, and none of that has happened. So we may have to widen our definition of what cinema is. Maybe it's not a theatrical experience anymore, but somehow moving images are going to be around forever in some form.
I also think that one of the advantages of video has always been the fact that small countries could get into the business now. If you think about the rise of Nollywood in Nigeria, where people were making films on VHS and selling them successfully and becoming directors. And then now they make them on high quality HD video, even sometimes on 35, even though Nigeria has barely any movie theaters. There are almost no movie theaters in Nigeria, but they would simply sell them or rent them to the public. So I think, again, of Iran, where so many of the films are made at a level of basic craft that you can almost show them. If I were teaching film production, I would show some classic Iranian films and say, look what you can do with your idea. And it isn't going to cost that much money, because not many of these films are. I remember when we met Kiarostami, and he was talking about Taste of Cherry. And I said, how do you film all these scenes in a car? He said, well, the cinematographer sits in one seat and I run the sound. I said, that's it? That's how you do this? Yeah, that's how they do it. So it's very artisanal. It's very craft-centered, almost manual, work. And I think a lot of filmmakers will go in this direction. I think Iran kind of pointed the way towards, by using video, pointed the way towards a simple but direct kind of filmmaking that kind of got lost in the age of, as you say, these big blockbuster superhero films and so on. The idea that you don't really need that much to make a good film if you have a good idea and a good execution. So video has helped out a lot, I think.
Well, I think you have to be very lucky to be in a situation where you don't have to teach and can just be a full-time film historian. I was lucky that way because exactly when I got my degree, we wrote the textbook. We got the contract and wrote film art, and I've always had an income. But I don't know very many people who have managed to do that.
No, for me, it was, the other thing is, to me, I would hate to have to choose because the teaching helps the research and the research helps the teaching. So for instance, many of the things I do in my research, I try to bring into the classroom to show the students. But on the other hand, sometimes something will happen in the classroom and you'll think, oh, that could be an interesting idea. And you'll learn from that. And certainly, if you work in a graduate program the way I have, the graduate students are very stimulating and have lots of ideas. And you learn a lot from their research, and so I would hate to have that source of ideas blocked off. I would like to be able to continue. I really always liked teaching very much. I love to teach. But at a certain point, I just felt that the university's demands on me were becoming so great, I couldn't do my research. So I wound up retiring. But I have come back and taught courses. I taught one just as the COVID epidemic was starting. And I actually didn't like the kind of situation we're in now, the remote teaching. I didn't like it at all, but I did enjoy the other sessions, the face-to-face sessions, because it was just nice to be back in the classroom after several years, to talk to students, get to know them, hear what they have to say. It was pretty great. So me, I like both. I always like both.
Yeah, and I think even though I have only taught at the University of Wisconsin a couple of times briefly, and that was long ago, still having, the colleagues, I have the same colleagues that David does. I go to the departmental colloquia that are held each week and listen to graduate students or professors give talks. And I have access to the university library. And it's, I don't think I could do this if I were out on my own somewhere.
Yeah, we're lucky being where we are. It would be difficult if we were in a small town university in a state that doesn't have many resources like our archive or something. Yeah, we've been very lucky. Our circumstances were fortunate. We're very grateful. Thank you for your support.
Thank you for asking us. This has been really an honor to speak to you all.